A common task to perform with compositing is adding motion blur to animated objects. And even though we can do this in the actual cycle's render itself, as you may have seen in the rendering course, once we perform render time motion blur, we don't have the ability to tweak it without re-rendering. However, by adding this during compositing, we can tweak it however much we want, much more quickly. The only downside is render time motion blur is more accurate. And sometimes with post-process motion blur, we can get artifacts, but by and large, the difference isn't too noticeable. So in order to add post-process motion blur, we need to enable this vector pass in our passes section. And you may have noticed that over here in our render layers now, we have this speed socket that's been added to the orb layer. So for some reason it's named speed over here, but that is the vector pass. Now that we have that enabled, I actually need animation of my orb object. So let's jump to the 3D view. And for frame 1, I'm going to move our orb off to the left, hit I to insert a location keyframe. Now jump to frame 10, move that in X to about there, I to insert another location keyframe, and then move our cursor to about frame 7. That way we're in between keyframes and seeing the peak of our motion. And let's render an image. With that finished, we'll jump back to the node editor, enable our backdrop, and in order to add this motion blur, I'm going to move the composite and viewer nodes off to the right a little bit, minus this pass combo node, to make room for what's called a vector blur node. So Shift A to bring up our add menu, and in the filter category, I want vector blur. Now we'll plug that in after our alpha over node. And I have two sockets down here. This gray one is for what's called the Z depth information from our scene, and then our speed socket. So let's plug in our speed. And you can see that that blurs our orb, but not on the edges. To accomplish that, we need to plug in our Z buffer value. And now we have a fairly believable motion blur. Inside this node, we have a samples option. So the higher we go, the more accurate our result becomes. The lower we go, the more segmented our blur becomes, but the faster it does render. So let's see what 8 looks like. If you were interested in faster render times, you might get away with that. Maybe even 12. Yeah, that looks a bit better. Anyway, the blur is the amount of blur. So if we go down, that's cutting it in half. If we go up, we get more blur. I recommend leaving this on 1 because that's likely the most accurate for the speed of your object. And then we have a couple min and max speed values, which if we look at the description, the minimum speed for a pixel to be blurred is apparently used to separate the background from the foreground. So let's bump this up to, let's say 2. And there's a very, very slight difference. If you look right here in our image, it just seems to maybe clean that up a little bit more. I'm not really sure. I've never used the speed min and max value, but I have used this curve toggle, which if our object has a curve in its motion, the vector blur node will compensate for that. Otherwise, all of the motion is going to be linear and straight. And so as you can imagine, changing our motion blur settings with a node in compositing is much faster than re-rendering our 3D scene, but it is less accurate. So you'll have to make the decision for what best suits your project.